Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Bernadette Smith. Bernadette was recently re-elected to a second term as an NDP member of the Legislative Assembly in Manitoba. She represents the riding of Point Douglas in Winnipeg's North End, where she was born and raised. Some may know Bernadette from her work as the co-founder of both the Coalition of Families of Missing and Murdered Women in Manitoba and the Drag the Red initiative. She also organizes the annual No Stone Unturned concert for missing and murdered persons in Manitoba. Bernadette's sister, Claudette Osborne, has been missing since 2008. Bernadette, thanks for joining us here on Face to Face, and we're at the Manitoba legislature. Did you ever think that you would be an elected member to the Manitoba legislature?
Absolutely not. In fact, growing up, I didn't even visit this place, so I didn't see this place as a place that reflected me as an Indigenous person, because growing up there weren't any elected Indigenous people in this place. So yeah, it's very surreal to actually be working here and representing people in Manitoba.
What led you to public life and running for the NDP?
So I didn't really see myself as someone who would be, politically engaged in terms of being an MLA, but when my sister went missing in 2008, I started getting more and more involved in lobbying, really. I'd be out on the steps protesting for, asking for more services for Indigenous families that were, struggling with someone going missing in their family, or more services in terms of seeking justice for families who, were going through the justice system because their loved one had been murdered. And one day I found myself in the office of Andrew Swan, and at the time he was the Justice Minister. And my sister had just gone missing in July 2008, and we had made an appointment to come and visit him. I think it was around October, because we had tried to access victim services, and at the time they told us you couldn't access it unless someone was charged with the crime, and we were like, we're blown away by that. So we made an appointment. We came and met with Andrew Swan, and we lobbied to have that change so that it would include families, who were seeking justice to find out who had murdered their loved one, but also for families who didn't have any answers. And that meeting went really well, and within 30 days that law was changed, and we were able to access those services, and that really started to pique that curiosity of, you're always outside looking in, but what if you were on the inside actually helping to make those decisions? And a few friends of mine had run for office and were successful, and some not, but having worked on their campaigns and with them, I got a first-hand view of what it would be like to really work for the community, and it was something that I was already doing with the coalition work I was doing, the Drag the Red work I was doing. So, this just made sense as a next step to be on the inside helping to make those decisions.
In Manitoba, we're seeing municipally, provincially, federally, many more Indigenous candidates stepping up, some of them getting elected. What do you think's behind that?
Well, I think there's been a path forged, right? I think about someone like Oscar Laughlin, right? And that's the first Indigenous politician that we know of that was elected to the Manitoba legislature. Of course, he was a man, right? And then we saw Amanda Laughlin in 2015 be the first woman of Indigenous First Nations ancestry to be elected. So certainly when you see, people coming before you and creating those spaces, you see yourself reflected in those spaces. So I talked a little bit about not, seeing myself reflected here in this place, but now I see little kids coming up and they're like, "You're Bernadette Smith. You work in the Manitoba legislature." And I always tell these little kids that you too can, work in the Manitoba legislature. And I think it's something that they can now see themselves reflected in. So it's really made a huge difference to see people, all over Canada being elected to office.
You mentioned a bill that you brought forward on child welfare, and many of our viewers will know that in Manitoba there's still well over 10,000 youth in care here. Nearly 90% of them are Indigenous. Can you tell us a bit about your bill and what the aim was there?
So growing up, I was a kid that ended up being in care myself, and a lot of it had to do with the ability for my mom to get extra support to be able to parent me. She was a single parent, so I didn't have, my dad lived in Norway House, which was about 900 kilometers away, so it wasn't like she could get extra support. So this bill was really aimed at helping families to stay together and get the supports that they need within their home, rather than removing kids from their community or from their home, because they don't have, let's say, the supports in terms of helping a parent to help a struggling, teenager that's going through something, whether they're hanging around with some peers that aren't so positive and they're getting into some areas that they normally wouldn't, or whether it's a parent struggling because, she's got a high hydro bill and she had to make the choice to keep her lights on versus putting food on the table. Parents shouldn't be having to make those decisions in terms of, do I put food on the table, pay my hydro, and risk getting my children apprehended. I think that we as a system need to really shift the way that we support families. So when I was apprehended from my mother, it wasn't because of poverty, it was partly because of poverty. I was running away from home. My mom didn't have a support person that could come in and help her. She didn't have the money to hire someone to maybe come in and, be a support worker to not only her, but to me. So I certainly think that we have to continue to decrease those numbers, work on reunification for families, and work on not even, taking children out of their homes, but really, making sure that families stay together, that they're strengthened with the support that they need.
Well, there's certainly members of the party, yourself included, that this is a huge issue for, but is it difficult, I guess, to speak about politically when, the party also did oversee the huge number or increase of the number of kids in care?
Well, I can't speak to that because I wasn't here when that happened, but I can certainly speak to, going forward, and as a legislator coming in, that was certainly an area that I wanted to work on because, a new government came in. I came in a year after, and that number was still rising. Although, there were things that were said in terms of we're going to decrease numbers. The way that children have been counted within care have changed. If a child is living with a family member, they're no longer a part of that count, right? So it's not that kids, the numbers are decreasing. It's just that the way that they're, counting kids in care is decreasing. We need to continue to make sure we have a full picture of what that looks like, where kids are at, and, what supports they need. If I'm, in care and I'm living with an aunt, I still need some support living with my aunt. So I should be still considered a part of that count. So certainly, I'm coming in as someone who's seen firsthand, the detriment that, removing a child from a home can have. I'm getting emotional now because I think of my sister, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and our families need as much support as they can get, and we should really work on decreasing those numbers, but decreasing them in a really full capture picture kind of way where we're saying, kids are returning back to their parents and they're getting the support that they need. Just because they come back home doesn't mean that the supports disappear, right? But that we continue to support those families so that if they're moving to a different area, let's say, their stability is kind of, taken away and then they have to start all over. So we still have to continue to support those kids.
So many of our viewers will also know you as an advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and we're going to talk about that, but we just got to step aside and take a quick break. and then we'll return here with Bernadette Smith on Face to Face. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Bernadette Smith. You've mentioned your sister Claudette, who went missing in 2008. What do you want people to know about her?
Well, Claudette was someone, who would give the shirt off her back to help someone. In fact, we heard quite a few stories of her helping other girls. Someone it was wintertime, they didn't have a jacket, they were cold, and she wasn't far from where she was going, and she gave this young woman her jacket. My sister was someone who lit up a room when she walked in. She had this laugh that really came from her belly, and you didn't even know what the joke was, but her laugh was contagious, so you would start laughing with her. She was someone who loved to be around family. We had lots of family gatherings. We would go to Birds Hill a lot in the summer and have barbecues. Kildonan Park when we couldn't all make it out to Birds Hill. And family dinners, I think Thanksgiving's coming up, we would often get together, and she just loved being around people, family, loved her kids. She was a mother of 4. Her daughter Patience now is 11 years old. She was 2 weeks when her mom went missing, and her oldest just had a child, which he celebrated his first birthday, so she would be a grandmother.
Your family was upset with the way that Claudette was portrayed in the media at the time. Do you think, have you seen changes over the years in the way that the media covers stories like this, people's lives?
Yeah, I think there's been, a bit of a shift, definitely, because it was, the headline was Aboriginal sex trade drug woman missing. And you had to read into the second paragraph to actually know who Claudette was, that she was a mother, that she was missing. And so we certainly see, that narrative shift a bit in terms of, headlines. But we also still see, women being portrayed as, addicted to drugs, and, they work the streets. And these women are more than that, right? And we often don't humanize them. And with my sister's case, that really hurt how the public reacted to her case. There was a lot of blame, well, she put herself in that situation. Where was her family? Why was she on the street? What do you think would happen, right? Rather than painting this picture of, she's a mother of 4, she's missed, she's loved, her family's been looking for her for the last 10 days, and so it really dehumanizes, I think, and gives the public permission to really turn a blind eye. And I think that's contributed to the overall way that we react to people that are missing in Manitoba, even I think across Canada, because, there's another missing person, and it's like the othering starts to happen. I don't live in the North End, I don't have to worry about that. Or I'm not a woman, so I don't have to worry about that. Or I'm not Indigenous, so, that doesn't affect me. But in reality, that affects everyone in the community. If one person goes missing, that could happen to anyone.
Do you feel there's been a shift in the way that police treat these types of cases?
Well, I'd like to say yes to that question, but I don't feel that things have shifted all that much. I think about, Helen Betty Osborne in 1973, being murdered in the Paw, and the conspiracy of silence and people knowing what's happening, right? And not coming forward out of, whether they're scared or they don't have a relationship with the police to tell them, or, whether, it's difficult, because we certainly feel that people know things out in the community, and that the relationship is lacking with the Winnipeg Police. When Claudette went missing, we actually set up our own phone line so that people could phone us. And, I certainly don't feel that sometimes the cases are taken as seriously as they should be. Like when someone's missing, I feel personally that should be projected out to the public, like not 24 hours, not 48 hours, but immediately, especially if it's out of character. And I say that because, you know, in my sister's case, it was 10 days before they actually reported that she was missing. And no family should have to go through that, right? We still have families that'll come to us and say, our loved one's missing, you know, we've gone and reported them missing. The police still aren't, you know, putting their missing picture out. So we certainly advocate for families to this day. And we certainly want to see a day where we don't have to advocate for that it's an automatic. And, you know, it's tough because it's also, I feel like it desensitizes the community in terms of, you know, you're always seeing a missing person, you know, on the media. But that's better than not seeing them, right? And then hearing a month later or 10 days later, and sometimes I don't remember the day before. I was like, what did I wear yesterday? Or, you know, what did I have for dinner? So to get that information out there as soon as possible is critical in terms of helping to bring someone home or solve a case.
You were somebody who was skeptical and critical of the national inquiry, and hoping we'll talk about the calls for justice. We just need to step aside for one more quick break, and then we'll return here with Bernadette Smith on Face to Face.
So for us to be able to occupy this space is very meaningful to families and Indigenous people here in Manitoba.
Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is NDP MLA in Manitoba, Bernadette Smith. And Bernadette, as a family member, you were skeptical of the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and you know, it cost nearly $100 million, money you felt could have been spent in other means. What would you have preferred to see happen with that funding?
Well, we would have liked to see a national action plan. So the federal government, you know, giving autonomy to communities, to provinces, to be able to take some of that money and put it into whatever their community needed to address, you know, the high violence of number or of incidents in their community. Certainly Manitoba is different from, you know, Vancouver, so I wouldn't say, you know, having a blanketed kind of system throughout. But we had called for a national action plan in 2010. We actually collected about 50,000 signatures, not only from here, but BC also took that up as well. And really looking at, you know, what is it that provinces need in terms of, you know, addressing this, whether it's making sure that, you know, a woman that goes in for, that is a victim of domestic violence, that there's support offered to her partner as well, right? And that, because ultimately that partner, it could be the father of her children, you know, could be someone who contributes to, you know, their financial situation. And ultimately, this woman loves this man. She doesn't love to be hit, but she, you know, she wants to be with this person. And, you know, we have a history of colonization here in Canada, and it's certainly become a learned behavior in terms of the violence that we see, you know, resonating and coming through from being in residential school. I think about the sexual, you know, violence that women are facing as well, in terms of helping, you know, to support and making sure that there's 24-hour spaces within, you know, even our own province here. I know that Isabel Daniels has been, you know, advocating for a 24-hour safe space for women. We've seen the federal government commit to funds for Tina's Haven, you know, for our youth, and certainly having education, you know, be a part of it in our schools, and really changing the child welfare system, because we see, and I said this earlier, a lot of the people that are, you know, have gone missing, and I've worked at Marymount for 12 years, and I probably know about 3 of those girls, young girls under 18, you know, that have either been missing or gone murdered, and they were in the child welfare system. I think about, you know, the high levels of incarceration rates of Indigenous people, 80%. You know, it's a it's a suppressive system. We need to really change that to a rehabilitative one and figure out ways to give people alternatives to, the behavior that they have. And certainly helping to support families. I think about our own family. We've been searching for the last 11 years. We don't get any funding from anywhere. Everything we do is out of our own pocket. I think about the catchaways as well. Same thing, out of their own pocket. They're excavating, dumps, they're dragging lakes, and there's no support for families. In our province here, we used to have a special advisor to women's issues. That person worked directly with families who were affected. And unfortunately, when this government came into effect, they eliminated that position and left really families struggling with, where do I get support? Who's going to help me advocate with the police? Like, who's going to help be my voice when I can't be my voice? Right? So little things like that, but really looking at system changes and supporting families to stay together and rehabilitative services.
It seems as though most levels of government, the calls for justice have already been forgotten. But you and I have spoken about this before, that it's up to the average person as well. What can they do?
Well, when someone goes missing, and I talk about this all the time, instead of turning a blind eye, like, how do we help support that family? I think about Candace Dirksen. She was 13, I was 9 at the time. I remember this like it was yesterday. Not being able to go play outside, the community really coming out in droves to look for this little girl. Somehow we've moved from that to like just changing the channel. So we as society really need to shift the way that we treat and really support one another. It's not going to take only the federal, provincial, and municipalities and the police, but it's going to take us as society to really, help one another and not turn a blind eye to it, and really help people get the help and support they need.
You host a number of events for families, including one recently here at the legislature. How important are those events for yourself and for the families out there?
Well, families often feel like they're alone, that the rest of society really doesn't care, that it's your loved one, and that, you're at home waiting for a phone call, you're at home waiting for, the door, someone to come to the door to give you that news about your loved one. Think about my own stepmom in the first year. She barely left the house, right? So it's super important for people that aren't directly connected to this to come out to show, these families that they're not alone, that there are people that care, and that there's people willing to help, in terms of whether it's searching or coming out to give support or, helping to fundraise, whatever it is, that they're not by themselves and that there are people that truly care that aren't directly connected.
Well, Bernadette, we thank you for your advocacy, which is certainly important to many of those families out there, and for being with us here this week on the show.
For sure. Thanks for having me.
And that is all the time we have for this week on Face to Face. We're always looking for new guests, so if you have any suggestions, please email us at news@aptn.ca. This show and past episodes are also available as podcasts. You can find those at aptnnews.ca/face-to-face podcast. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for tuning in.